Hello and welcome to Sounds on the Couch. I am very excited to introduce our interviewee today. So, Elsen Price is a Sydney-based contemporary artist. He is coming on to talk to us today about not one but two single releases, Now and View from the Moon Revisited. He is also soon to release his album, The Lifelong Daydreamer. I know that you'll all be keen to delve into the man behind the music, so let's bring him up now and we can start having a chat. Hello, Elsen.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you.
So we'll just jump straight into the questions. So would you be able to maybe give us a little bit of background about who you are and what first got you into your music?
I'm a Sydney-based musician. I've been here since 2008 or so, and I guess since 2012 I've been specialising in solo performance. So I'm predominantly a double bass player. So double bass is the really big violin-looking thing that people play in orchestras and play in jazz bands. And I've been doing that professionally since about 2008 or so. But since 2012, I've been doing that as a soloist. And what started out then as being I was playing once a week in a cafe for a few hours. It sort of developed into doing festival performances, and the last few years before COVID was going overseas and doing workshops and performances in various parts. And and this new release is, I guess it's sort of a bit of a reflection of where I am now with everything. It's been a wonderful little process, especially with COVID. I think COVID's made everything a little bit different, but it has been quite wonderful.
Yeah, no, great. I have a burning question that I'd like to ask you. How do you manage carrying this double bass around when you're going to all these different performances and tours and festivals and things? I'm sure there's a few logistics to think about.
Getting it around just normally is pretty fine. Flying it can be a bit of a debacle. You just have to make sure. I've got a very large instrument, so double basses are quite big in general, but I've got sort of the biggest you can get. So when you're flying this instrument, you really need to make sure that you get all the spacing stuff sorted out. I did have a bit of an issue just before COVID with doing a regional performance, and unfortunately the case itself was 2 inches too big for the actual luggage holding. So I had to schedule a different flight on a slightly larger plane, which was a bit of fun. But other than that, it's not too much of a drama. But if you're overseas as a double bass player, there is this culture of people borrowing instruments and trading instruments while people are overseas, which is quite wonderful. Over in Japan, did a few performances in Tokyo. The venue owner that I played at, Mr. Narisuki, he's actually a double bass player, so he let me use his double basses, which were quite wonderful. And when I was over in the UK, at the Wells Cathedral and also in Edinburgh, those were both hosted by double bass players as well, so they let me use their instruments as well. So if you have that opportunity as a double bass player, it is very welcome. But locally, I mean, around Australia and even over in New Zealand, it isn't too much of a drama getting it around.
Great.
Actually, one trick is actually moving it from the airport, because at every airport they've got a shuttle bus or those types of taxis or those sort of larger taxis, and you need to be very careful with how you negotiate around those sorts of things. I found a few issues when I was over in New Zealand. I think it's in Wellington in particular. They don't actually have large capacity taxis. What they do have is small hatchback taxis, and you need to convince the driver that it will fit in the taxi to actually get from the airport to where it is you've got to go. I guess that's a little bit of part of how it all works.
I would love to hear some of those stories sometime that you've told the taxi drivers to convince them that it's going to fit.
Actually, that one in particular, his daughter was learning violin, and he just liked the idea of such a large violin-looking thing, and he just wanted to help me in whatever way he could, which was actually really quite nice.
No, great. So would you be able to maybe let us know a few of your musical influences and inspirations, like who has inspired you in your musical journey?
There's quite a number of different bass players who have worked in this area for a few years. Double bass solo performance only really started to become a thing probably in the 60s or so. That was with a wonderful American bass player called Gary Carr, who really sort of took the solo bass thing out of the small sort of concert hall into the public eye and started doing lots and lots of CDs and recording, doing world tours, and really popularized the idea of solo double bass. He's a very, very respected double bass player worldwide, simply for that. And of course, there's Francois Rabat, wonderful French bass player, or Syrian-born French bass player, who invented new styles of playing, incorporating world music, improvisation, all that sort of stuff. And he started to create a few new things. Then I guess modern players like Edgar Meyer, Renard Garcia Fons, a bunch of other people, especially a bunch of new people, because there's a bunch of very, very, very talented young double bass players who are really pushing boundaries. Yeah, it's sort of this interesting pocket of musicians who are willing to explore it in this sort of soloistic sort of way.
Just creating a whole new genre. It's amazing. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about your releases. So you, as I said before, you've released 2. Would you like to maybe take us through a little bit about maybe why you've decided to release 2, and also what inspired you to create those?
So this was from a performance I did at the start of COVID. I did a 2-hour-long improvised performance at an underground venue in Sydney. It's undisclosed because they weren't sure of the legalities of the whole thing, so it was a live stream performance that was recorded. And it turned out quite well. It was a full 2 hours of that. And these 2 singles happened. The first one was, I think, an hour and 40 minutes into the performance. This is the first single, Now. That's when that one popped out. And then the other one, The View from the Moon Revisited, that's actually right at the end of the 2-hour performance. And I released both of these because I thought they sounded quite good by themselves. So the actual 2-hour recording is a full 2 hours of constant sound. And it's the first time I've also incorporated electric bass as well, so bass guitar. And what I was doing is I was alternating between double bass and electric bass for those 2 hours to create something a little bit different. Because I do have 4 previous albums that are all solo double bass, so I decided to do this one a little bit differently, just because it was sort of COVID, and I just sort of thought of the performance myself. I'm just going to do stuff. I don't care what happens. It will just happen, whatever happens. And yeah, I was actually quite happy with it. But I think the inspiration for both of these pieces, the first one, Now, it's on the electric bass. It's a bit of an exploration of different kinds of harmony that you sort of come into as an improvised musician. So there's various ways in which musicians think about harmony, and there was a few specific motifs or little melodic ideas that I came up with that I sort of explored through that one, which I thought was, in hindsight, I thought, oh, that was quite nice. And the last piece, View from the Moon Revisited, is a piece that I always play at the end of a long improvisation. So this piece, I recorded it first in 2014 with my album Red Planet. That's the first time I performed it or recorded it. And since then, I always put it at the end of all my improvised performances. So it's, and it's an interesting piece because I think when you revisit a piece constantly in an improvised setting, you always play it a little bit differently.
Yeah.
So it's sort of a little bit a bit of a chronological sort of biography in itself, that every time I play it, it's a little bit different, and it's a bit of a reflection on that whole process.
Yeah, and I guess it opens up a whole new discussion about your creative process as well, because people that are sitting down and writing songs and going through in great detail, when you've developed this through the improvisation, it's very interesting.
Yeah, it was an interesting thing to go into solo improvised performance. So, as I said before, I started this in 2012, and I did that simply because I was in the middle of studying and I was looking for something sort of more interesting to do. At that point, I was playing a lot in like cover bands and doing that sort of fairly standard, simple type of music. And I was sort of looking for things a little bit more challenging, a little bit more creative. And I was lucky because the cafe, at the time I was living in Marrickville, and the cafe across the road that I went to every morning, I had a chat to the owner and said, can I come in and just play for a few hours on a Sunday morning, for free coffee and that sort of thing. Like, yeah, sure. So that sort of became a regular thing. And, you know, when you put in that sort of stance of having to do it regularly, you sort of start to think a little bit more seriously about the whole thing. And that transitioned to me doing lots of street performance at the Rocks. So there's a lot of, I guess without COVID at the moment, there's a big culture of street performance, especially in the city and also around the Rocks area. And that was really interesting because that was a full 8-hour sort of day of improvising. And, you know, sort of the challenges associated with that and also the interesting things that happened with that. And from that, sort of looked into festival performing and that sort of thing. And yeah, it has been an interesting transition, but I think now when I look at this music, I think I look at the challenges differently than what I did then. I think the challenges now is probably looking for something that I haven't done before, as opposed to then I was looking for, you know, creating a language or creating a style that suits what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, and I'm sure it would take a while to build up that stamina as well, to be able to go and play a string instrument for 8 hours. Like, I'm sure your fingers would have struggled for a while.
Like any habit, it's if you do it regularly, your body and your fingers and all that sort of stuff get accustomed to it. I think the biggest challenge with that was actually running out of ideas, because you sort of run out of all your good ideas in the first hour, and then you have to sort of try and make things interesting after that. That's my own sort of experience with that sort of thing.
Yeah.
The longer you go, it's harder to come up with something that's interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess you're also about to release your album, The Lifelong Daydreamer. So would you like to maybe tell us about, was this also developed through improvisation, or was this a different story?
Yeah, so that's the recording from the start of COVID. That's where these two singles came from. It's the full 2-hour performance.
Oh, okay.
It was interesting listening back to the performance, because I think when I'm performing, I sort of, you know, go into my own little world and I sort of go for it. I think that's my own little secret with that sort of thing, is to sort of do what I feel like playing and sort of don't think about it too much. And I guess listening back to it, and sort of, it was a bit of a visual journey, sort of when you listen back to this sort of stuff. So I think if you're doing lots of free improvisation, often when you listen back, you don't really hear yourself playing the music. Sort of go, this is interesting, because it hasn't been written down, it hasn't been practiced. So when you listen to it, it's almost like the first time you've experienced the music, even though yourself actually played it. And listening to it, I sort of, you know, got into a little bit of a, you know, visual sort of representation of what was going on, and end up sort of creating a bizarre little storyline in my head on how it all sort of joins together. And I thought, okay, cool. I guess that's what the album will be. It'll be about daydreaming. It'll be have this bizarre little story where you're flying around and doing weird stuff, that sort of thing. And the 2 hours is divided into 26 sections, which is going to be the 26 pieces on the album. And that should be out quite soon. I did a little bit of a preview performance of that on Thursday last week, which was really quite nice. I did that at 5:05, which was great. I think we sold out, which was good. I think that's sort of the trend now with COVID, is with limited capacity, so it's a lot more sold out performances, but wonderful energy, and had a wonderful young trio called the Chameleon Trio plays as support, which was which is really quite nice. But looking forward to actually releasing everything out, and that should be in the next week or so.
Fantastic. No, it's really exciting. So I guess I've got a question. If anybody is looking, maybe they haven't done a lot of improvisation, or maybe not any, how can they get started in sort of going along that route?
I guess it determines what sort of musician they are. Or maybe what they're coming from. If you're coming from it, I guess, as a beginner, I would just look at it as an experiment. I think pick up an instrument. Don't assume that you need to know any particular way to play it. I mean, if you're playing something more complicated than a string instrument, like a brass instrument or a woodwind instrument, you probably need to get some sort of activity happening here to make the instrument work, so you can sort of start making some noise. But, you know, idiomatic instruments like drums and piano and, you know, strings even, just sort of go for it. And just sort of simple ideas. I think that's always the way in which we build, you know, complex ideas, is just building simple ideas. So just sort of go for it. I think more experienced musicians don't sort of feel like you need to know certain things in order to do it. I think improvisation became an academic study probably about 40 or 50 years ago or so, and that sort of put in a lot of ideas that you need to know certain things in order to make music. So that's when people go and study improvisation, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is very true for in a genre perspective, but in a creative perspective, you can do whatever you like. You know,
Yeah.
I'm sort of going down the route of wanting to do performances and do festivals and all that sort of stuff. So my thoughts on improvisation are in that sort of frame. But if you're wanting to create just for your own enjoyment or even collaborating with people, that's the most wonderful aspect of improvisation. Actually, when I was in Tokyo, it was a wonderful culture that I experienced there in the improvisation and experimental community there, in that where I played, we did a collaborative thing afterwards, and it was a mixture of very high-level professional musicians, and then people with normal jobs and people that have picked up a new instrument, and everyone just sort of collaborating together. And there was nothing creatively or musically detracting from that, because everyone was there to explore, and the culture was so, I guess, rich in that perspective that people weren't afraid to try new things. Obviously, the professionals were doing some pretty crazy stuff, but also there was this incredible sax player who's a construction worker by day, but he played his saxophone in the most terrifying way. I think it'd be very hard for anyone to emulate this sort of thing. It was literally a 30-minute performance, and what he was making the saxophone do could almost make your head explode. It was crazy. It was hard to describe. I highly recommend going and exploring that if you find yourself in Tokyo. But I find that aspect with experimental music very good. It's just, I don't know, I guess the way I think about experimental music in that improvising sense or that collaborative sense is it is community music. It's music that isn't sort of dictated by people having to know special things in order to be involved. Like it's very much an inclusive sort of thing.
Yeah. So how has collaboration itself kind of changed the way that you approach music?
I think every time you work with someone new, I really trust the idea that everyone has a specific idea and a specific voice. And so I tend to rely on that. If I'm in a situation, I'll go, okay, this is me doing what I do, and you know, hopefully that'll work. And then also that same respect to anyone else who's involved to go, oh, that's what they're doing. And you know, you don't have to like everything that other people do. I think that's a very important part of art criticism is we shouldn't just automatically like what everyone's doing. And of course, we shouldn't not like what everyone else is doing. But yeah, you'll take on things that you enjoy, but also you get to experience new things, I think, in a collaborative sense. If you're constantly collaborating with the same people, you'll probably start to lose some of that edge a little bit. But with that said, I've got some very long-term improvising ensembles that I work with that's always kept fresh. I think we keep that fresh in the sense of, you know, changing the goal or what we're doing. But yeah.
Yeah, no, it's great.
Did that answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely. If there's if people are looking at collaboration as well, you know, what are some things that you've learnt that you've had to be aware of potentially within collaborations?
I think just be yourself. I think that's the easiest way to do it. If you're working too hard to try and do something that you either don't understand or isn't you, then you're probably not going to really experience the collaboration in the most honest way. You're probably going to be working so hard to try and do something else that all you get out of it is you may or may not achieve what it is you're going for. You sort of missed all the other elements of what's going on as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. What have been the biggest challenges for you, maybe outside COVID, just as an artist in general?
I think the challenges being based in Sydney is there is a very interesting thing happening within, I guess, the music industry here, which has been sort of creeping up for the last 10 years or so with various laws that have been introduced, various restrictions put on venues, a culture of noise complaints, not just for venues, but also for musicians in general, which makes the whole process of making music a lot more complicated than what it should be. I think if something's illegal, like if something's ridiculously loud and causing an absolute ruckus, then there probably needs to be put some limitations on there. But if a venue that's existed for 50 years is just doing its usual Saturday night thing, and then suddenly someone moves in and complains about it and the venue's shut down, I think that's a real negative. Well, it's negative for the music industry in Sydney, because that's one venue that's now disappeared. So it's one way, it's one another, aspect of the economy of the whole thing. And I think New South Wales in particular it definitely has an opportunity to go the other way. We just need to be much more strong in our objection to some of these things that have been brought in. I find that when people actually speak about these things and speak about them publicly, and even letting their local councils know, and letting the New South Wales government know that these things aren't appropriate. I mean, one particular is the $100,000 price tag on festivals for police presence. That's something that's been heavily disputed since it was introduced, and there's still been no clarity on that, especially with COVID. Is that something that should be happening after COVID as well? Festivals will be in a very tight position for a number of years because of the losses they've had this year. I think that from that perspective, that's sort of been the biggest challenges I've had. I think here is just that real realization that New South Wales could be a lot better, but unfortunately we're in this position where we need to be more, have a bigger voice as an industry, and I think also as an audience. If you're somewhere and there's nothing going on, but ask the question, why isn't there anything going on? What's stopping things happening here?
Yeah. So do you think the biggest way that people can sort of encourage change within that is to use their platform to really raise awareness and object to what's happening?
Yeah, I think as a country we are just naturally quite apathetic to most things. I think when something big happens, we'll get angry for a day and then we'll go, oh well, I mean, that'll be fine. And I don't want to. I don't want to say that's an Australian negative thing. I mean, it's great that we're so laid back. There's various other parts of the world which aren't so laid back. But I think from a music industry perspective, because the music industry in Australia is a $16 billion industry. So in an economy sense, it's quite an important industry. And I think things like that need to be known more national-wide. More people need to understand how much of an important industry it is. And the losses from that have huge economic issues for the communities. Like, for instance, King's Cross, there's been massive economic issues there for businesses and various other ripple effects from the shutting down of venues from that, and the various restrictions that have gone on there. I think just being very clear with those, and people at least allowing themselves to listen to these statistics and to these fairly strong facts of a healthy music industry means a healthy economy, which means a healthy community, and also a place where people actually get to have fun, which is great. And really understanding that we're actually seeing the negative side effects of these laws being imposed and this culture of, people essentially, well, I mean, small government sort of not really supporting the arts in the way it should.
Yeah. Do you think that COVID itself may, like, as we come out of COVID, do you think that that will inspire any further change in regards to some of these changes and policies?
It's already happening now with venues suddenly having limited capacity, and also people not able to see live music for 6 months. Suddenly, every single venue is selling out. I think it's a strong sign that people really want to go out. I think people were maybe a little bit more relaxed about it previously, like, oh yeah, I may or may not go out. I think people are more interested in engaging more because we've sort of all been locked up for such a long time, which I think is a great reflection of what people want. And hopefully that's something that carries on to creating more initiatives in the community to actually build the music scene up again.
Oh, fantastic. So I guess, sorry, I've lost my train of thought. I went off my script. So do you have any advice that you would like to offer to any aspiring musicians that might be watching this recording or might be listening to your music?
I think just work very, very hard. I think that's sort of the bottom line of it. And people come from various backgrounds. I came from a rural background, and there was no sort of professional musicians around and all that sort of stuff. And I sort of, had to sort of put two and two together, and sort of left home when I was quite young to sort of pursue it. And from the other side, there's lots of people who grow up around, lots of music and lots of support and all that sort of stuff. And regardless of what your background is, you need to work very, very hard at it. I think that's the one thing that often isn't talked about, is just what sort of work ethic that you put into this. Because it is an industry where the more work you put in, the more results you get. If you want to get things happening overseas, then you need to get overseas and do it. Or if you want to learn a certain style of music, then you're going to have to find people who understand it, or you're going to have to. Some people travel to learn music simply because where they are isn't the best place for them to learn it. And I think really acknowledging that, and then also understanding that, it's it's a very rewarding career. It's not rewarding, I think, in the traditional sense, but rewarding in that you're doing something that you enjoy. And personally, every musician I'm around is a very inspiring person. You're surrounded by very, very interesting, inspiring people constantly. The conversations you have on a daily basis probably aren't the conversations that most other people have in the 9 to 5 sort of sphere. And it's something that I'm very thankful for. It's something that I really, really respect, I think, from the musical community, also, as a musician. But yeah, I think it's just, just getting involved as much as you can. I think that's the easiest way anyone can pursue music.
Oh, fantastic. And is there anything else before we finish up that you'd like to share?
It's being released through Ripper Recordings. That's run by James Ryan, a wonderful Australian sax player, who better known for being the leader of a wonderful group called the Subterraneans, which when I was studying, they had a Sunday night residency at the Townie, which always sold out. Absolutely crazy music. But I've been very, very lucky for him to release it. And it's going to be a Bandcamp only release, which I'm very happy about, because I have had previous releases put out on Spotify. These singles are out on Spotify, but unfortunately streaming doesn't work anymore as a musician, unfortunately. It's going to be put out on Bandcamp, and on that specific label, it's got James' music. It's also got a bunch of other wonderful Sydney-based artists, Joe Fabro, Aaron Michael, Steve Hunter, all these very, very interesting Sydney-based musicians. And yeah, if you're interested in checking out a bit of original jazz music, I'd highly recommend checking out Ripper Recordings.
Fantastic. And you said people can go to Bandcamp, but where can people find your social media?
Just look up Elsen Price. I've been blessed with having a very unusual name, so ELSEN PRICE. So if you type that in, there will be various things that pop up, and I sort of try to promote things as much as I can. But there's a few nice videos out there and a few other recordings that I've done, and yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been really insightful.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.